The prevailing model of political analysis treats polarization as a static, horizontal line. A society, or an individual, is placed at a fixed point. You are either on the left, on the right, or somewhere in the center. That mental framework originates from a specific historical moment, the seating arrangements of the French Revolution, where supporters of the king sat on the right side of the assembly and supporters of the revolution sat on the left. But a fixed geometric line fails to explain real-world behavior. It can't account for why entire populations violently shift between extreme political poles over a single generation, oscillating wildly even when their physical geography and demographics remain unchanged. This animated diagram illustrates the brain kinematics model thesis. Political polarization is actually a dynamic strain response system. It operates not as a flat spectrum, but as a continuous wave propagating through a population. In this model, left and right are not fixed ideological doctrines. They are multi-scale strain waves, organic, emergent responses that form when a society is forced to redistribute accumulated pressure. To understand the wave, we have to isolate the strain at its foundational level. It begins as individual psychological weight, chronic job insecurity, anxiety of a declining social status, or the acute daily perception that the system's rules are unfair. These isolated individual burdens eventually synchronize. People living under similar pressures align their experiences, coalescing around shared community narratives like "we are ignored by the center" or "we are losing our historical place." As those narratives harden, the friction stops being about individual economic or social struggles. It crystallizes into strict, unyielding group identities, drawn sharply along lines of class, race, religion, or region. At the state level, these identities are weaponized. Political parties and digital media algorithms scan for these newly formed clusters, selecting specific channels of grievance and actively reinforcing them to mobilize massive voting blocks. The pressure then breaches national borders. Modern transmission channels, mass migration, the shared memory of regional wars, and sudden global economic shocks carry these local identities across the international system. A national political movement is a scaled-up version of individual psychological strain, organized and directed outward. The exact same underlying social pressure can produce entirely opposite political reactions. The direction of the resulting wave depends entirely on how a society interprets its pain. This matrix traces how strain routes into political action. A left wave activates when a population frames its collective strain through the lens of inequality, systemic exclusion, or exploitation by a ruling elite. The systemic response to that specific interpretation is a demand for resource redistribution, sweeping structural reform, and an emphasis on social inclusion. But if that identical strain is framed differently, the wave reverses. A right wave activates when the pressure is interpreted as social disorder, the loss of cultural identity, or displacement by outsiders. The system responds to this framing by demanding the defense of physical and cultural boundaries, the reinforcement of traditional hierarchies, and stricter central authority. Political directions serve as adaptive defense mechanisms. They are the methods a specific group deploys to resolve its perceived existential vulnerability. This equation calculates polarization intensity. Accumulated strain creates standard political friction, but transitioning from normal civic debate into existential conflict requires mathematical catalysts. The numerator holds the accelerators, accumulated strain multiplied by group boundary sharpness, the memory of injury, and threat framing. The denominator provides the institutional inhibitors, cross-group contact, and institutional trust. High societal trust and interaction divide the pressure, keeping the overall intensity manageable. When those accelerators outpace the institutional inhibitors, the social contract breaks. Political opponents are recategorized from civic rivals to physical, existential threats. The heaviest multiplier in that escalation is the memory of injury. A historical grievance, a previous conflict or forced displacement, lies dormant until a modern crisis reactivates it, supercharging the current threat framing. Toxic polarization is a mathematically predictable outcome. It occurs when institutional trust fails to dilute the perception of an existential threat. This chart plots a nation's shifting political orientation across a phase space, tracking economic strain on the x-axis against identity strain on the y-axis. A society residing in the lower left quadrant experiencing low economic and low identity strain, maintains moderate centrist stability. A shift along the x-axis into high economic injustice triggers left-wave cycles. A shift up the y-axis into high identity threat triggers right-wave cycles. Countries that push into the upper right quadrant, managing high strain on both axes simultaneously, experience rapid, volatile oscillation between extremes. External shocks act as kinetic energy in this model. A sudden inflation spike or a rapid migration wave can instantly push a nation's coordinates from a stable zone into a high-strain quadrant. A nation's ideological identity is simply a set of coordinates, continuously moving through phase space based on its real-time strain load. Because strain is a constant physical reality, societies must build architectures to distribute it. Governance is the primary mechanism for managing that pressure. The modern international system relies on fixed, rigid borders. Agreements like the UN Charter prioritize strict territorial integrity over the fluid frontiers of the past. Because states can rarely release pressure through external expansion or shifting boundaries, the accumulated strain is forced entirely inward. Hyper-centralized governments attempt to manage this by suppressing local pressure. The strain compounds invisibly until it hits critical mass, resulting in sudden, massive public resistance. Conversely, extreme decentralization fragments authority. It traps strain inside local oligarchies or weak municipalities, destroying the state's capacity to redistribute resources or enforce civil rights. Total centralization and total fragmentation act as strain amplifiers. They bottleneck pressure rather than releasing it. This phase diagram plots centralization against state stability, revealing a narrow peak for optimal governance. Managing high internal pressure requires a multi-level, polycentric architecture. The model relies on an integrative center that is strong enough to enforce constitutional rights, maintain macroeconomic stability, and redistribute resources across regions. That center must be paired with robust, localized autonomy. Local nodes adapt to everyday friction and act as immediate shock absorbers, catching strain before it synchronizes into a national wave. The Nordic welfare states provide historical evidence for this approach. They combine a strong national state with robust elected local government managing daily services. Political oscillation still occurs within these systems, but the localized shock absorbers restrict the amplitude of the waves, preventing them from becoming destructive. The most durable societies do not attempt to eliminate strain or mandate strict ideological uniformity. They design their institutions to distribute, absorb, and transform pressure before it weaponizes into polarization.